Today we're talking about GraphQL. I'm Jamie, pretty much full stack engineer. Spend my days writing JavaScript. Before we get into it, could I just get a raise of hands of who's looked at GraphQL or who uses GraphQL? Okay, cool. Looked at it. Using it like in production and stuff? Awesome, cool. So it's still relatively new on the scenes. I'm kind of just here to kind of just show you guys what the hype's about, what people are talking about, and kind of just address some of the myths that are going on around. Should I use it? Is it a REST killer and all this? But we'll go into all that fun. So I'm NoTrab on Twitter, Barton backwards. I would like just to give a shout out to Johnny on Twitter as well. He was going to do a talk in Gatsby, but he's ill. And obviously you can use the hashtag LeadsJS. Could be a good way to enter the competition. Give him a shout out. So yeah, I spend most of my days reinventing commerce at Moltin. We're an e-commerce API, and so I get to work on building really cool, fun tools and document a lot of the stuff there as one of their developer advocates. So I'm not going to be talking about Moltin today, but what I'm talking about can be used with any sort of headless API on however you wish to consume that data, but also you can write servers, and we'll go into all of that. So let's have some fun. So as you guessed it, I'm going to talk about kind of the current state, what's going on exactly, and we're going to set the state today in 2018 what GraphQL looks like. Show of hands as well, everyone's familiar with React. This talk's going to have a lot of React referencing to some of the tools that we're going to be using. Of course, there's loads in other languages, and I'll cover those as well. So like I say, we're going to talk about what it is, what it isn't, what it can do, who's behind it, that kind of stuff. So just want to go through a brief little history. So it was about 2012, some Facebook developers kind of had a lot of problems with managing data and getting all that data to all of their different devices. They've got mobile devices, native mobile devices, we've got websites, they've got like Facebook Lite at one point, trying to like just push as much data out there onto their websites and kind of keep those requests small. So they kind of looked at GraphQL and come up with this idea that turned out to be GraphQL, and they open sourced that in 2015. And from then there's kind of been a steady stream of people looking to use it and adopt it and help it grow. Now it's a huge community-driven project by a number of companies. So 2016, there was a few conferences spinning up when GraphQL sort of first emerged. GraphQL Europe was one that I went to last year, and I went again this year. In last year, there was half as many attendees as there was this year, so I think that kind of shows significantly the kind of the trend, that an adoption rate, but also the conversation changed from sort of, GraphQL is interesting. I might try it out. I might try and figure out what's going on. But then the conversation kind of really changed to, we've used GraphQL for the past year. These are all the benefits, but these are all the issues we've had. So the conversations of are all more about production stories and horrors that people have had than just let's try this new thing out or let's not. And I thought it was really cool. Like people dove in there and tried it out and were having a great time with it. So 2016, the community continuing to thrive, and I think it's down to Prisma and Apollo. Prisma, they have some really great tooling around GraphQL. They created a GraphQL Playground, GraphQL Yoga for building simple GraphQL servers, and a whole host of other things that we'll go into as well. But Apollo, they have a client library for Angular, Vue, Ember, React. React's probably the most popular one, and it's one that I use on a daily basis. And they also have a back-end tool as well for writing servers, so that's cool as well. So we'll look into the server side a bit later on. This talk will kind of cover a lot of the JavaScript and the client library. So let's move on to 2017. And 2017, we've seen this GraphQL as a service. It was still relatively new. People weren't using it, and the guys over at GraphQL, they kind of built this GraphQL as a service platform where you sign up, you get a URL to your GraphQL server, and you use their platform to create all your types, create all your models essentially, and then you kind of just mutate data and query data and subscriptions and all of that, host your files and images, and just use those as a headless API, a single source of truth. But that kind of had its own problem. They had this idea of custom functions, so a bit like Lambda, you would push your own little Lambda function to the GraphQL interface, but then you had to edit in the GraphQL interface. It's like uploading a zip to Lambda. It's painful. So they kind of moved away a little bit to with the community to 2018. It's now, I would say, people are tending towards looking at GraphQL as a layer between a database and the front end. So you have a front end and you want to talk to a database, you kind of just go through this GraphQL layer. So your teams don't have to kind of drop everything and start building a new API. You can just adopt GraphQL as you go. So Prisma, as I say, this talk's going to have some examples around that and how you can use it. And these guys are at the forefront, I believe, on pushing the GraphQL server with their amazing sort of mission, which is to build a GraphQL layer, an ORM, for any database. Right now, they support MySQL, Postgres, and maybe it's Cassandra or Mongo. They're looking to obviously support others like Scylla and stuff. But I think it's quite a phenomenal statement to make, like, hey, we're going to create an ORM for pretty much any database. So if you want to get started with GraphQL, just plug in your database and you're good to go. I think that's really cool. But first, I just want to clear a few things up about GraphQL. And it's not a REST killer. GraphQL just is not a REST killer. I've seen this a lot during the early days where people are like, oh, it's going to replace REST. There's so many endpoints. Those endpoints are cool and structured well. That's awesome. But it's not a REST killer. gPC, REST, they're going to long live, so they're all going to still be there. GraphQL at the end of the day is just a choice. So whether you build one endpoint for your UI and your people can consume your API through GraphQL endpoint, or they consume it through REST or any other setup you want. If you have a microservice approach and you want communication between the microservices, you could use GraphQL or you could use gRPC, you could use GraphQL, REST, whatever you want. It's a choice. So I'm not here to say everyone go use GraphQL, just saying, hey, it's kind of a cool thing. I'm going to show some examples on the front end why I think it is cool. And it's not a React thing, but it's really awesome with React. A lot of the client libraries that's out there at the moment, sort of Apollo client, Urkel, and a few other ones like GraphQL request, I think it is, kind of work really well with React. And they've got these kind of hierarchy components to allow you to get data. So you kind of, if you're used to React now, it's kind of, everyone was talking about CSS and JS and like such a mind-blowing experience that was. Now it's kind of, well, I've got this component that it knows how it looks, it knows how it should mount, and it knows where the data is coming from, and the queries in there as well. So it knows how to present itself and how to get that data. I just think that's like quite a huge step from the conversations we were having maybe a year and a half ago around CSS and JS. GraphQL is not a database. Sometimes they'll be having a conversation with someone around GraphQL and they're like, oh, well, you know, it's such a pain to move databases and imagine all those migrations you have to write. It's kind of not what it is. Yes, Facebook have their graph database and there's other things like NEO4j, I think it's called. And there's obviously loads of graph databases, and with GraphQL, yeah, you kind of have to think in graphs a little bit, but it isn't a database. It's not that kind of resource. And the best thing, I think, is it's incrementally adoptable. So if you wish to use GraphQL today, just write a resolver and a server, hook in your UI. You could even just still use a request over HTTP. You don't have to use a special library. Just use fetch, make a call to the GraphQL server, and get that data. You can just plug it in, play, and it just over time you can kind of build on top of your GraphQL server to do all of the other things that your existing API may do. It's entirely up to you. It's a choice. At Moltin, we use the JSON API spec, and it is a really good alternate. Before I started, I was like, oh, there's a lot of endpoints here. But actually, when you follow a good specification like JSON API and how they handle some of the things that GraphQL tries to solve, there's not too much difference between them, apart from just how you access it and how you get the data out of it. But using things like includes and all of that, JSON API has a really good specification for all of that, and I don't think there's that huge difference. I think it's just more around the education and taken on board all of the production sort of disasters that have happened with GraphQL over the past year, some of the stories that people are writing about, and I'm sure we'll hear a lot more. Airbnb, we're talking about dropping React Native for a whole host of their own reasons. It's not to say that it's a bad choice. I think we'll see the same with GraphQL. Some people have jumped on it really early and then it's been a huge mistake. I think we might see some of that come about, and I think we'll get a lot out of that to push the community along a bit further as well. So it's just something to watch out for. And a few people I'm talking to are kind of having a few issues with it, and we'll go into those. So GraphQL, what is it? We've kind of explained what it's not. So it's a query language. More importantly, it's a specification. Every sort of 6 months or so, there's always some RFCs on GitHub, what people trying to put into there, and then Lee Byron and the folks who, some of them at Facebook still, will jump in there and kind of just try and push the specification and release it. Yeah, it's a real community-driven project now to what it was sort of 2-3 years ago. So who uses GraphQL? These are just a few that I've picked online that I've seen, but there was some stuff from the Lie Bible I've seen. Product Hunt, I've watched loads of talks by Rado on there. Go check that out on YouTube if you want to see how Product Hunt deal with GraphQL on their entire website. It's really interesting. They use style components, they use GraphQL, they use React, all of the modern tools, and sort of the fun sort of bleeding edge stuff that people are would like to use, but maybe they've got restrictions around. They're kind of at the forefront and they're just kind of pushing ahead and using it, and I think it's interesting to see some of the details that are coming out of there. In GitHub, obviously, their API is GraphQL as well now, which powers their desktop application, their website, and various other things. So the first part that I wanted to go into a bit in more detail is the client side. And we've got kind of, at the moment, in the beginning we had Facebook's Relay. That came out around 2015, the same time as GraphQL was announced. There's kind of binding for the front end to query this GraphQL database, or the GraphQL endpoint, sorry. And we also got Apollo client as well. And these are just kind of plugins you put in, like a React component, you pass it a query, it then executes that to the query because it knows where the GraphQL endpoint is. So one of the things I liked immediately when I first looked at both of those clients was I could immediately just get rid of this REST spaghetti that I had going on. Had a lot of endpoints that sort of some of them were fine, like /v3, v4 for posts because the response has changed over time, and we need to support different devices. So sometimes you may see endpoints like this where you've got /v3 post, include this, exclude that, limit this, offset, paginate, all of that stuff. And it was really a pain to manage on some really client-heavy UI sort of focused applications where there was a lot of logic going on. It just kind of become a mess. But as soon as I started to build smaller components and I kind of tried to do the React thing of creating small components for each thing on the page, I could immediately just say, well, this is the query and this is the mutation, or this is the subscription for this component. Them two kind of match, and that's all they really care about. I haven't got to create some Redux thunk actions and have my application bloated. I kind of had one file that did it all, and I thought that was really awesome. So that request to get post, what does that look like in GraphQL? So this is the typical GraphQL query. We have this query part at the top, if I do this right. So we get all posts, and then in the arguments here we can say pass a limit. And the Scala type here of int, it's not required in this example, but you can pass in a limit there, and then it's passed on to the query, and then we can immediately see in here, hey, we want the ID, the name, and we want the makers. And in Apollo client, we can use this defer thing, so we can say this could be a really expensive query if we think of this in product hunt sense. There could be a whole, huge amount of makers. We might want to get the makers, other products. We might want to kind of keep this going and request more data from this query, and then with the multi-part on the HTTP transport, we can then just pass that along when it resolves. Obviously, if your browser doesn't support it, it just kind of just waits and then returns the data to you. So when you run the query, you get this response, and it's in the exact same format as you requested it, which is really cool. I'm only getting what I've requested, so I'm not overfetching, which is really, really helpful to reduce those response payloads. If you've got a native application or you've got a website, and if you're on one page and you're only viewing a user's profile, sometimes when I've created applications before, and it could be on my part a bad architecture decision, I've sometimes just thrown all of the data back, and it's kind of been a huge pain for users to load all that when they didn't need to. But over time, you kind of may have URLs that say profile with friends, profile without friends, profile with photos of friends, and you have these weird things going on. Then you look to JSON API, and then, I don't know, I kind of got myself in a mess, and when I seen GraphQL and I could see I could do this kind of stuff, I was like, whoa, I was like, that's pretty cool. So next is the mutation. So we've got query, we know how to get data. How do we actually send data back? So we got a mutation this time, and to the same endpoint, we can just throw in this mutation. So all that's different here is, instead of query, it's mutation, and then we give the mutation post, and we can pass in some arguments of what we want to post along. But in the same request, we can request what we want back from that post. So I might add more here, so I might add in who made the product, any photos, but when I post this, I might not care about it. All I might want is the ID and the name to do whatever I want. So this is quite cool as well. And obviously you get that exact same payload back as what you requested. Next up, we've got subscriptions. So again, we have query, mutation, and subscription here. All we change here is subscriptions. We pass the subscription name, give it a name, actually call the subscription. And then we've got this interesting thing here of mutation. So was the subscription, was it a created at, an updated at, a deleted at? You can actually just subscribe and listen to these events that occur on the server, and they will just push through over WebSockets to your application when these events happen. So you can update your UI in real time when this is listening. And then you can pass along the node as well. The node here, you may see if you're using Relay, some objects are referred to as nodes and edges. In Apollo, it's really simple. It's just everything's just it's just data, the name of your object. Nothing's really heavily nested. But in subscriptions, this is up to you. But it comes back as node in this example. 2 seconds. Okay, it's working now. So yeah, we run that subscription, and then if we made the same post, so sorry, yeah, we run the subscription. We're listening for new posts that occur. Then if we take the mutation that we made before, we run this. We'll then get this come up and pass to us over the WebSockets, and then we can update our UI with this new post that was created. If this was deleted, it was a deleted comment, we could just remove that comment in real time, or if it was updated, we can update it as well. So GraphQL, why? This is all like interesting, I think. It's different, but it's nothing new. Like, we do this already. Some of the things I like particularly are it's self-documenting. So if you say this query accepts these arguments, these Scala types of int, string, float, and any custom ones, and they're required, the documentation, you can go look at that and instantly get an idea of how the API works. You haven't got to run any sort of documentation along with your REST APIs. It's kind of just all built in, which I think is really cool, and you can just export that and use that. And there's no more client-specific endpoints. And then in the next slide, I've actually got this again, but there's no more client-specific endpoints. So like I was saying before, of /post/users, you've got none of that. You've got one endpoint, and you can just request the data for the device that you need the data for. Strongly typed, so you're not going to have any issues when you make a request. The request it'll not go through. If it will, but you'll get an error that it's not supported. Obviously, some of the tooling around that stop you making requests because it says, well, you're adding a post, but URL or the name's required. You can't push this through. It's quite helpful there, so it's got that for free. Obviously, we've got these subscriptions which we've seen and live queries. Live queries is quite interesting. I'll tweet out a video that I seen at GraphQL Berlin, and it was a really cool concept of this, the live queries that's coming around. So you can just make a query and that just kind of updates in real time, and it's quite cool. And then it's incrementally adoptable. I think it's easier to version. It sort of is, sort of isn't. You can kind of just keep adding stuff and then deprecating it and pass warnings through. But yeah, the versioning's kind of a bit weird. I see people putting it on just /v2/GraphQL/v3 GraphQL, or some people just keep adding more to their resolver types and their query types, and yeah, that kind of leads to a few issues. But and then I think it enables faster prototyping, but this comes with caution. So I'll come in at the cons now. So I think there's an easier barrier to entry. So why is that a con? Well, people can just get going with GraphQL, I think, incredibly easy because of a lot of the tooling that Apollo and Prisma and Facebook have done. But I think this last one, the easier to introduce performance issues, links in with that, because people can just start building servers, and you'll find a lot of front-end engineers like myself will just kind of write a GraphQL layer to get the data and don't really care how the data's processed, and they kind of come up with this weird graph almost for their database that the UI needs, and it kind of introduces a lot of performance issues when those resolvers are being built. So yes, I think if you would like to use GraphQL, it's very easy for a front-end engineer, and I think that the front-end engineer can own the GraphQL server layer and then pass it off to the back end when the project matures. If you're not using GraphQL and you want to, that's one way you can kind of get it into your stack. But the lack of status codes as well is kind of, everything comes back as like 200 okay. So if you post something and it's failed, you not get any sort of specific error codes for that, any duplications, and you don't get any of that. You kind of have to pass it back through with the payload and the response that comes, and then obviously update your UI with that as well. And then one endpoint to rule them all. You've got one endpoint, you kind of can't see, just looking at it, looking at all of your components and things, like what's going on. If you're not familiar with React and things, or with GraphQL, you can't see how the API works. But that's where I think the documentation is very easy to follow, and you've got things like the Graphical Playground, which I'll show you, can make that a lot easier to use. And then we're going to move on to the back end quickly. So there's some implementations in the background I'm going to go through and show you. We got JavaScript, which I enjoyed. It's kind of one of the first ones, but some of these other ones, especially Ruby. Ruby gets a lot of love from Product Hunt. There's some Go implementations, but I think if you are looking to use GraphQL and you've got a preferred language, then a preferred language that's not on this list, there are other ones like Lua and Groovy and all of that stuff. If that's your stack, go try it out, see if there's anything there. If there's not, figure out how you can go around building implementation in your preferred language and try and push that along. I think that's one of the things at the moment where in the Apollo and Prisma stack is everything is JavaScript, and it's really hard for like .NET developers to go, oh, we want to use that. There is a .NET implementation, but again, I don't know how complex or how well built out it is. Opposed to the JavaScript one, there's a lot of tooling around JavaScript, and I would love to see it expand to other languages as well, because it should. I think we've got to test it in all these languages, get more developers exposed to it, so we can kind of grow this thing together, and if it does become the rest killer, then everyone's on board. Some tools for the back end as well. Just very quickly, Apollo Server is just a very small concept of being able to pass it, define your graph types, and then the resolvers. So if you have a query, like we've seen before of all posts, there needs to be a resolver, and then that knows to return the ID, the name, the URL, the makers. That does the processing, that does all of the fetching to the database, and then returns it to the resolver. Apollo Engine is quite good for tracing queries, so if you make an expensive query, you can see that the maker's request was actually really expensive and how long that took. A lot of the tooling with Apollo Engine allows you to do that. They've got a free plan, they've also got a paid plan which keeps your logs around longer, and it's really cool. It helps when you're building a UI to see what is expensive, and you can kind of work on improving that. Apollo Launchpad is an online sort of scratch pad of building a GraphQL server, and I'll show you one in just a sec. And you can just define your server there. You get a URL, and you can kind of just use that as a fake GraphQL endpoint and just keep building. We've got Relay, which I explained. We've got GraphQL Yoga and GraphQL Playground. GraphQL Yoga, again, is the same as Apollo Server. GraphQL Yoga came around because using Apollo Server, there was a lot of people throwing all these sort of things in, and just to get basic setup. The guys at Prisma, they introduced GraphQL Yoga and just made it very simple. Import GraphQL Yoga, define your definitions, resolvers, and app.listen, and it worked. Apollo Server is just even better now than GraphQL Yoga, I think. There's still a few things that GraphQL Yoga does that is takes away some of the boilerplate code you have to write. And then you've got GraphQL Playground, which is like a supercharged graphical interface, and I'll show you what I mean by that as well. So I just want to, although it's marked as a demo, I just want to just show you what that code actually looks like in an application, how it runs. So I'll just do that now, if you can just bear with me a sec. So there's a few ways you can implement GraphQL. So you could have an entirely separate endpoint, which is its own API. It's its own thing, and it talks to the database directly. Or you can do what I do and enjoy doing, because it really annoys backend engineers. If you're working on a project, like, no, we can't switch to GraphQL, just go and build a little GraphQL server that talks to their API, and you can kind of progress the GraphQL API along, and you kind of force the backend engineers to someday rewrite everything because all of the clients are using it. And they go, oh, there's latency, and you've got to have to redo it. So that's a cool little trick. Very mean. So we've got this simple React application here. It's going off making some requests to the API that I've got running. And this is just going to UI faces. Like I say, UI faces provide this API, REST API, and you can pass all of these parameters. But the server that this application is requesting to is just this thing here. So you probably can't see at the back, I'm sorry. I'll try and zoom it in. So we're just importing fetch and some things from this graph tools library. We're defining a type of faces, and then we're saying, well, we can pass in a limit and an offset and a gender, and then we can actually just call this here as well, and pop them in. It returns exactly what we need. So again, this is like graphical here. So immediately I can just see, if I type down, I've got gender. What's a gender? Well, I've got two options here. I'll go female. Hit return. Fingers crossed. Awesome. I know why that is. He says. Yeah, the application is not using this. So I'll continue to go through it and I'll show you that in a sec. And then we define a type of face. So this faces just returns an array of faces, and a face has a name and a photo, and those are both strings, and I've just sort of stolen these from the response that comes here. So we could match up email and photo and position as well. I think at the time I was building this, those weren't available. And then we've got this enum type as well, of gender, and we've got male and female. Then scroll on down, this is a resolver, and this is this REST wrapper, the good way to get your backend engineers to like you. Define the query type of faces here, and then you've got access to the arguments that were passed in, the context, if to get the headers from the request, or any other sort of database objects you have. We're just doing some simple, like really simple but confusing looking JavaScript to just map through what comes back from the API and mashing it into a response that the GraphQL server can understand. And we're just making a request and awaiting a response and returning it. A fairly simple example to request to a REST endpoint, but this is a GraphQL endpoint that we're making a request to that's then going to the REST API, and it's just one way you can use it. And then this is the Graphical Playground. So this is the same thing as what I have over here, but this is just running locally on my machine. So I hit run here, and I can do this. I can obviously pass in that gender, female, run that. I think they've changed their API since I last did that. That's probably why that's not working. I can obviously pass in an offset and things as well. And you see here, that photo is a string type, so it's easy when you're using the interface to see what's going on. Then we've got the schema over here, which is said. So any queries or mutations that we would have would be documented in here, and we can see that we've got all of the things here, what's required, and all the different argument types for that request as well. Cool. So I didn't cover permissions or auth in that example. I'm sorry, I left the slide in by mistake. But I can show you that later. I've got a repo on GitHub as well, which kind of I just published today, which kind of gives a little bit of an example into that. So I'll tweet that afterwards. Kind of you just run it, download it. It uses Prisma, Apollo server, and all of that stuff, which is fun. But I just want to kind of finish up on GraphQL being a choice. I'm not here to say you must use it. I've hopefully just kind of given you some inspiration to maybe just go check it out if you've got some difficulties on the front end with querying data, or you're already using it, but your back-end engineering team, your project manager is saying we can't do this. Well, as a front-end team, if it's going to help you do your job quicker, then just go build that sort of latency layer, and then you can get the back-end engineers to do it. So thanks very much for having me. Hopefully that was interesting. Got any questions afterwards, probably head to the public was saying. We can chat there about how bad REST sucks. Cool.